I think many of you are already aware that when we look at people who often speak about gender, speak about patriarchy, speak about feminism, one of their criticisms is often that Marx or Engels or Marxists didn't write much about the question of women's emancipation. So first of all, that's not correct at all. In fact, Engels wrote this entire book called The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State. And it was also naturally looked at by Karl Marx, and they were of the same opinion in this regard. So it's absolutely untrue to say that they paid no attention to the question of women's emancipation. In fact, it would be more correct to say that as far as the theory of patriarchy is concerned, Engels deserves at least a modicum of credit for having developed this theory in a new way and in a new form. Patriarchy is not difficult for us to understand. It means the rule by the father. Literally, that's what it means. Pat, padre, all of these terms mean father. And archi always means rule. So it means rule by the father. But of course, it doesn't mean literally the father. It means rule by men. And if you look at history, you will come to the conclusion that whether you look at politics, the economy, or you look at the history of philosophy, you look at culture, even if you look within the family, through most of human history, power really and decision-making really has been focused and concentrated amongst men. If you look at a history of the greatest individuals, 100 greatest individuals, what do you find there? You find that about 90 to 99% of them are men, not necessarily women. You look at the history of states and kings and kingdoms and so on, who are you looking at? You're mostly looking at men. If you look at the history of entrepreneurship and capitalism and so on, again, you're mostly looking at the men who are the entrepreneurs, capitalists, etc. Although many women workers also work, and children also work during the Industrial Revolution. So you don't see a lot of women. Even if you pick up literature, English literature, Urdu literature, etc., you find mostly it's the men who are doing the writing. So has history been mainly patriarchal? Yes, it has. It has been mainly patriarchal. The question, of course, is why is there patriarchy? Why does this exist? Well, if you turn to those who are of a religious persuasion, whether they are Christians or they are Muslims, in fact, from pretty much many different religions, you get a similar answer. The answer you get is that God somehow or the other made men superior in this regard. For example, if you turn to the ulama karam, you often hear from them the phrase, कि women are naqisul akal. Naqs means that they are deficient. Akal, of course, you know what that means. And in fact, there was a very famous case of this professor who was teaching Darwinian evolution in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And he was forced to recant what he was teaching and write an apology. And although his apology was for Darwinism, which is what he was teaching because he was a biology teacher, and one of the phrases, the ulama forced him to also write that I accept and I completely agree with the view that women are naqisul akal. The theory is that there are certain things such as masculine traits. For example, men are considered to be physically stronger. They are considered to be more aggressive, not necessarily physically aggressive alone, but aggressive also in the sense that their personality trait is that they know what they want and they want to try and get it. They're considered in this theory to be more intelligent, although I have my very strong doubts about that, and also even more creative. And these masculine traits, therefore, allow men to dominate, or so one theory goes. What are the feminine traits? Or traditionally, feminine traits are considered to be mothering, caring, weaker, less aggressive, demure, more emotional, more passive, and therefore naturally subservient. So motherhood is considered to be a central feminine trait, fatherhood being a central masculine trait. So the traditional theory is that it's the masculine traits that allow men to dominate, and feminine traits are what make women retreat from the public sphere. Of course, the result of that theory would be that women would need to develop masculine traits in order to compete with men, which is not necessarily something that women may want to do, although they may as well. Now, in this traditional explanation, certainly in the time of the 19th century, the idea was that the further back in history you go, the worse it was for women. Their view was that cavemen were the most patriarchal, they were horrible, etc. They used to take women by the hair and drag them to their cave and so on and so forth. Those kind of images were quite common. Why? Because in that time in history, also the theory told us, physical strength was very, very important. Today, physical strength is less important, but back in the time when you had to compete with animals, etc., we are told at that time, physical strength must have been more important, and that's why men must have been more powerful than women at that particular point in time. And as civilization has marched forward, we are told, things have been getting better and better, and as we go further along, things will get better. This was the commonly accepted view in the 19th century. Okay? It's no longer the accepted view except amongst those people who never bother to read what is going on in history and what people are writing about. This view was also very closely tied to the idea of biological essentialism. So that meant that if biologically you were a woman, therefore you were bound to have certain traits associated with that. Being demure and being shy and being retiring and being emotional, being an emotional thinker, all of those things, etc. So these traits were considered to be linked to your biology rather than towards anything created by society, by the social division of labor, or by ideology, or by ourselves in the process of history as such. So, but the question inevitably arose, did masculine versus feminine traits create patriarchy? Or did patriarchy lead to masculine and feminine traits? Is it the case that men are more dominant in any given conversation between men and women, which they are, because that's just how innately they are, versus women who are innately demure? Or is it the case that because we have dominated in history, we feel that dominating in a particular conversation is natural, it's inevitable? Is it that the traits themselves made us dominant, or is it because we were dominant that we as men got those traits? That's the big question. To some extent, it's also quite a bit like the question we've asked when we looked at the materialist interpretation of history. Is it the environment that shaped us? Have we shaped the environment? How has this all happened? So amongst the medieval thinkers, scholars, scholastics, fathers, priests, and so on, who thought about the entire natural as well as social world in a metaphysical manner. In other words, they thought about the world as being fixed, as being given in accordance with a divine plan. The gender division of labor, or what was referred to at that time as the sexual division of labor, was considered to be quote-unquote natural. It was also sometimes referred to as the natural division of labor. Okay? So this was an example of a division which they considered to be eternal, unchanging, natural, and of course part of the divine plan. God has made things such that men dominate and women, are happy to be in the position they are in. All of this began to change dramatically in the 19th century as anthropology began to take off, as ethnological studies began to take off. Anthropologists were arguably some of the first to discover that in fact the societies that were pre-modern, for example the Iroquois Indians, the Aboriginal Australians, and so many other tribes across Africa and so on, what they began to discover about these indigenous tribes that had been unimpacted by modernity was that in fact they were more egalitarian with respect to women than the societies that were considered to be educated, civilized, and scientifically advanced and so on. This came as a big shock to many, many people who were doing all this traveling and trying to discover new societies. Some of the key features they discovered was that these tribal societies were often matrilineal. What that means is that if you were a person, you traced your family not through your father, you traced your family through your mother. You said, I am Taimur, son of Ghazala. That was your identity in society generally. That's how people recognized you. People didn't trace through the father. Secondly, they were matrilocal. What that meant is that the house was built around the woman. Today, a given house is built around the man. The man gives his family name to the children and so on. It's the man's house. The woman comes and lives in the man's house. This was not the case before. You may be shocked to discover that the house belonged to the woman, to the wife. And the man lived in the woman's house. And if for any reason they separated, the man would separate from that house. The woman continued to live in that house. It was her house. It was her abode. So in that sense, it was a matrilocal society, most of these societies. Now, one of the key figures that changed the way we think about this entire question of the relationship between men and women is this guy, Charles Bachofen. He wrote a very important book called Mother Right, an investigation of the religious and juridical character of matriarchy in the ancient world, written in 1861. Now, it's very interesting to see that Marx and Engels are themselves writing on the historical materialist or the materialist interpretation of history. Right at the time that they're writing that, Charles Darwin comes out with his theory. Right at the time that that's happening, Bachofen comes out and Lewis Morgan comes out with his theory. In fact, right at the time when Marx and Engels are developing the materialist interpretation of history, there's another guy also that they acknowledge who's also developed the same ideas as they have. So what did Bachofen write? He was of the view that if you look at older societies, they are not patriarchal. They are in fact matriarchal societies. The women often are the ones that rule over those societies, make most of the important decisions in that society. This was like, you can't imagine what an earthquake this caused, because nobody could have, in their wildest imagination, thought that this would be happening at such a far point in the distant past. He writes, Bachofen, this beautiful phrase which I've translated for you. Of course, it's not in Urdu, but in Myth, Religion and Mother Right, he writes, इंसानी वजूद के निचले तरीन तारीक तरीन मरहले में माँ और बच्चे की मोहब्बत इखलाकी तारीक में वाहिद रोशनी थी. It was the light in a very dark time. अपने बच्चों की परवरिश के नतीजे में अपनी अना की हदूद से बढ़कर किसी दूसरी मखलूक से मोहब्बत करना औरत मर्द से पहले सीखती है. To not just love yourself, but to love another outside of your ego is something that women bring to humanity as a whole. औरत इस तारीख के मरहले में तमाम सकाफत का ज़ख़ीरा है. In fact, all of culture and learning is with the woman in this period of history, not with the man who is more like a brute rather than being a person of learning. तमाम एहसान, तमाम अक़ीदत, ज़िंदगी के लिए मोहब्बत और मरने वालों के लिए गम. This is something that is brought to humanity by women. Now, the other great writer that inspired Marx and Engels in this regard was Lewis H. Morgan. He also undertook an ethnographical study of the Iroquois Red Indians, or Native Americans as we call them today. And this study revealed that the earliest human domestic institution was not patriarchal, but was a matrilineal clan. There was no patriarchal society amongst the Native Americans. It was matrilineal. By matrilineal, again, we mean that the lineage was traced through the mother. By the way, interestingly, if you look at the history of Islam, you look at the history of the Arabs, you discover that at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, Arab society was also matrilineal. Yes, they traced their descent through their mother. Later it changed, but at that time in history, it was matrilineal. You didn't know that. It's fascinating, isn't it? When we were looking at nature, the medieval scholastics thought that nature was static. When they looked at history, they thought history events occur, but the nature of it, the structure of it is static. When they looked at the stars, they thought it was static. Wherever they looked, they thought there was a divine plan. Everything was just static. It was metaphysical. What was now being discovered is that history actually evolves. Nature actually evolves. The stars, the planets evolve. Matter, everything evolves. This was the dialectical view of everything. The same thing happened with respect to the question of gender relations, or what we're going to refer to here as marriage. What they discovered is that the way marriage is today is not the way it's always been. Marriage itself has a history. Wow, the history of marriage. That's what they wanted to talk about. The family is never stationary, but advances from a lower to a higher form as society advances from a lower to higher condition, wrote Morgan. Just as the state evolves, just as law evolves, just as the economy evolves, just as technology evolves, and just as we evolve with all of those things, what else evolves with those things? Marriage, the way in which men and women come together and produce children. Systems of consanguinity are passive, recording the progress made by the family at long intervals apart and only changing radically when the family has radically changed. So with time you see that over a long period of time you see that in fact the way in which men and women have been relating to each other, the social relations of what? Reproduction have been changing along with the conditions of production. So as the forces of production have been advancing, and as a consequence of which the relations of production have been changing, the gender relations have also been changing along with that. So Morgan made a study of this, and he took history and he divided it into 3 different stages. This was very common at that time to use this terminology. Today we don't use this terminology anymore, but I'm going with the original terminology because, well, we're looking at the original work. So he divided human history into these 3 big stages: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. I want to point out to you that for Morgan, though, savagery is a more egalitarian society than civilization. So he doesn't necessarily use savagery only in a pejorative way, which we sometimes associate today. So what is savagery? Well, it's the period in which man's appropriation of products in their natural state predominates. In other words, there isn't much economic production going on. Phal ug raha hai, you find fruit somewhere, you find water, you find different things, and what do? You appropriate it. What is the difference between appropriation and production? In production, you actually intervene into nature to make sure that that thing develops and grows, etc. In appropriation, whatever is naturally occurring, you just take it from nature. So savagery is the stage of where there is mainly just appropriation. It's the most primitive stage naturally. And you'll see that he says in this stage, there was such a thing known as group marriage. We'll just talk about this briefly. Second comes the stage of barbarism, the period during which man learns to breed domestic animals and to practice agriculture and acquires methods of increasing the supply of natural products by human activity. So now you have what we could consider to be economic production, properly speaking. People are engaging in agriculture, they have domesticated animals, all of these things, etc. And here we see the emergence of the pairing family. Now different individual tribes or clans may reach these stages at a different period in their history. So it's not like that period is strictly defined. It's, for example, when you go to the American Indians, you may discover that they're still at the stage of savagery or at the lower stage of barbarism or whatever, right? They haven't reached the stage of civilization, whereas other civilizations may have moved forward, or other societies or tribes may have moved forward too. So this is not a time signature. It's more of looking at human history from the point of view of how far they have progressed in terms of their understanding of nature and their command over nature. The third stage is civilization, the period in which man learns a more advanced application of work to the products of nature, the period of industry proper and of what we today consider to be art. Okay, so this is the period, the modern period or the contemporary period, the period of civilization over the last 3,000-4,000 years that we know of: Egyptian civilization and Babylonian and Greek civilization and Roman civilization. All of this is this particular period. Please note that the division that Hegel made, that Marx then later follows, between the Asiatic mode of production, the feudal mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, all of that fits into the last stage over here, civilization. All of the stuff before civilization is what we today call the prehistory of mankind. Today when we use the term history and we say prehistoric, where is that line? The line is here. Okay, this is considered to be largely prehistoric, and civilization is what we call history. Now this again is a bit of a 19th century terminology. Many times we discard that. Some people use it this way, some people use it some other way, but you get the picture. Okay, the evolution of the different modes of production: Asiatic mode of production, slave society, feudal mode of production, capitalist mode of production, all of that is within this stage that Morgan is talking about. In other words, Morgan is looking at an even longer time span than the time span looked at by Marx and Engels when they did their historical materialist study. And he says this is the period of what is referred to by the Christian church, state, etc. as monogamous marriage. What is monogamous marriage? We're going to discuss that very soon, because it doesn't necessarily mean what it comes to you in your mind. it means something a little different. It means what it meant at that time in the 19th century, what was referred to as monogamous marriage at that time. Okay? So each of these stages, he then divides into 3 more stages. He says we have the lower stage, the middle stage, the upper stage. In the lower stage of savagery, man still lives in tropical or subtropical forests. Main thing to understand is man is a forest dweller, and by man I mean human beings here, okay? And was partially at least a tree dweller. This is what could explain how they could avoid getting eaten up by other animals. We used to run up into the trees to avoid being eaten, etc. Fruit, nuts, and roots served him for food. He developed articulate speech probably in this period of history, very, very old period of history. In the middle stage, the middle stage begins with the discovery and utilization of fire. Fire, of course, is one of the most important discoveries that mankind undertakes. There's a gorgeous book written by Peter Watson called Ideas from Fire to Freud. Itni moti kitab hai. It's the best book I've ever read. One of my favorite books. It's so good. And he talks about how man discovers fire. It's incredible. Anyway, so once you get fire, then you can cook food, right? Before that, you have to have it raw, however it is. When you have fire, you can take fish, you can cook fish, you can take meat, you can cook it. If it's cooked, it becomes softer. If it becomes softer, it becomes easier to digest. When it becomes easier to digest, what do you get? You get vast supplies of protein, which you do not get before you had fire. Before you had fire, human beings could not get that much protein from the diet that they had. Now they had vast supplies of protein. And now they begin to, from the river, they begin to follow the river, fishing as they go and using fire as they go. We've traced this out. And they spread over most of the earth in this particular way. They go up and down the rivers, etc. They follow the waterways, and then they create many, many places across the globe, etc. And this is also when they first create other weapons, like the club and the spear. The spear, of course, is very useful for fishing. So the fishing at this time is occurring like as spear fishing, okay? They go into shallow water, they use a spear, and they get the fish like that. That's how the fishing is occurring. Third up is the upper stage, which begins with the invention of the bow and arrow. This is the most advanced weapon and instrument available to mankind at that time. It is like the nuclear bomb of that period. Any tribe that knows how to make the bow and arrow cannot be defeated. They become the strongest tribe. Hunting becomes a regular source of food only in this period with the invention of the bow and arrow. Without the bow and arrow, you cannot really hunt because animals are pretty fast. You're going to run after them. How are you going to catch them? It's going to be very, very difficult. So it's the bow and arrow which allows you now to make hunting more regular. Before the bow and arrow, if you were lucky, you got something, but hunting was not efficient enough to give you a regular source of food. So hunting was not a regular thing that humanity could have done because it just wasn't efficient enough to feed you on a daily basis, right? Now, certainly with the bow and arrow, it's possible for it to be a regular source of food. In fact, that's a good question you ask, because the bow itself and the arrow, as well as the dhaga which you use to pull, that itself is very fine craftsmanship. To develop that also requires a high degree of working on the crafts, especially to develop what we call the composite bow, to develop the thread that you'll use for the arrow, to develop the arrow with a tip and with something at the back that will guide the arrow. All of this is pretty sophisticated stuff. So it indicates that mankind has now taken a huge step forward. This is also the period where they begin to create villages, although the villages are extremely small. That means settled, they're settling down, etc. And they also create wooden vessels and utensils, and they do finger weaving with looms, with filaments of bark. They have plated baskets of bast or osier, and they have sharpened stone tools. They have dug out canoes, etc. They make boats, etc. They have beams and planks, and they create the ark. And they use these things for building houses and so on. So there's a big advance now in their ability. So this we would call the upper stage of savagery. What was the form of marriage at this particular stage? At this particular stage, he says marriage is not something that's highly developed. In fact, marriage groups are separated mainly in accordance with generations. So age gap, generational gap, is what differentiates between the people you can marry and the people you cannot marry. So Engels writes, all the grandfathers and grandmothers within the limits of the family are all husbands and wives of one another. So are also all their children, the fathers and the mothers. The latter's children will form a third circle of common husbands and wives and their children. The great-grandparents of the first group will form a fourth. This form of family is now extinct, as is, of course, this mode of life. We can only estimate its existence by examining the tribes of Hawaii and Polynesia. Okay? So in other words, the idea of marriage is not very well developed. The kind of marriage you have is called consanguine marriage, in which basically the generations are separated from each other. People generally are allowed to be with anybody they want, but within the same generation, not between generations. Next up, we enter into barbarism. This begins with the introduction of pottery. And in this stage, you know that the anthropologists, they study different civilizations by looking at the development of pottery. Pottery is very, very important for anthropology and for ethnology as well. And here now you have the domestication and breeding of animals and the cultivation of plants on a much bigger, wider scale. And here also you begin to see that the old world and the American continent, they begin to depart dramatically. Till the stage of savagery, they're more or less equal. But after this stage, they depart. Why do they depart? Jared Diamond wrote a beautiful book called Guns, Germs and Steel on this issue, and there have been many studies, etc. In fact, Peter Watson himself wrote a beautiful book, I think it's called The Great Divergence, amazing book, in which he says, why is it that the Red Indians and the Aztecs and the Mayans didn't develop as much as the people on the Eurasian continent, who were became more technologically advanced than them? What was the main reason? Well, the main reason was that the old world, that is the Eurasian continent, had all the animals that could be domesticated and so on. They had all the varieties of cultivatable cereals, all except one. Whereas America, the American continent on its own, it had no mammals that could be domesticated except for the llama. And the llama was only in the southern part of America. And moreover, and they had none of the cultivatable cereals except for maize. So the natural environment over there was such that they could not get they didn't have cattle, they didn't have cows, they didn't have sheep. All of these played a very key role in the development of civilization in the Eurasian continent, in Iraq and Palestine and Egypt and so on. And these animals simply didn't exist on the other side of the continent. They didn't have wheat on the other side of the Atlantic. They didn't have all the cereals that we had. So they had a big disadvantage. That's why they didn't progress as far, because of the natural conditions, not because they were not intelligent or anything. Owing to these differences in natural conditions, the population of each of these hemispheres now goes on its own way, and different landmarks divide the particular stages in each of the two cases. So you see that up to this stage, they're moving in tandem with each other. But beyond this stage now, the fact of existence of certain natural things allows the Eurasian continent to outstrip dramatically the people of the American continent. Now you enter into what's called the middle stage of barbarism. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, but from this slide onwards, I have also put on the side all the female goddesses that were being worshipped in the ancient Sumerian Akkadian period. This is from a wonderful book that I will reference later called When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone. Fantastic book. It's also about how the transition occurred, that as you went from matriarchy to patriarchy, humanity went from worshipping women, as well as some men, to worshipping only men. All the gods became male when in society the males came to dominate. So that's what these pictures are, just in case you're wondering, is to look at, of course, from the period of savagery, from the period of barbarism, where patriarchy has not yet been created, you get the worship also of women deities, many, many women deities. So in the middle stage of barbarism, what you get now is the domestication of animals. Cattle and sheep and goats are the key players. Camels also, of course, and in another part, horses, etc. But what do sheep and goats and cattle give you? They give you milk. They give you lots and lots of milk. And with milk, you get cheese, and you get dahi, and you get lassi, which knocks you out, etc. All of those things. And those are very useful, right? And of course, as the animal If you don't require the milk anymore, you can slaughter the animal and you can have the meat and you can reproduce that animal. So you can have a ready source of meat even without hunting if you can domesticate all these animals. It's fantastic. This now begins what we refer to as pastoral life. And pastoralism plays a very key and important role. One of the most successful tribes of pastoralists are the Semites. The Semites are the ones who then create a new religion which we refer to as Judaism. Another very successful pastoralist tribe are the Aryans, Aryans as the British or as the Europeans like to call them. And they're a very, very successful tribe that then moves out of the Urals and the steppes, Central Asian steppes, and one section of them goes and conquers Europe, another section of them comes towards Asia, etc. So you get the spread of what we refer to as the Indo-European language. You get the spread of Indo-European languages because you have this one pastoralist tribe that's very, very successful. You know what Indo-European languages are? The language I'm speaking right now, English, is an Indo-European language. और जो ज़ुबान मैं अब बोल रहा हूँ, यानी कि उर्दू या हिंदी, ये भी एक Indo-European language है. ये दोनों languages, actually they are cousin languages of each other. And there are many root words that are common. You didn't know this. Yes, it's true. And in fact, Greek is an Indo-European language. Urdu is an Indo-European language, although with, of course, very strong Sanskrit roots as well, which, of course, is an Indo-European language, as you may already know. So these tribes, the Semites who lived on the grassy plains of the Euphrates and the Tigris, and the Aryans upon those of India and of the Oxus, and the Jaxartes of the Don and the Napier, these are the pastoralist tribes that are the most successful. They are the superpowers of the period. Why? Because they are able to domesticate these animals and utilize them. So the plentiful supply of milk and meat, and especially the beneficial effects of these foods on the growth of the children, account perhaps for the superior development of the Aryan and Semitic races. Cannibalism now gradually also begins to die out. So these tribes and their mythology, the mythology of the Aryans, the mythology of the Semites, becomes the dominant mythology now amongst those cultures that derive from the Indo-European language group. Of course, the Indo-Europeans mix with many, many other people and create many, many other ethnicities and so on. But as a language group, they continue to exist. Now we enter into the upper stage of barbarism, smelting of iron ore. This is the Iron Age. Alphabetic writing. Greeks of the heroic age and pre-Roman tribes of Italy, the Germans of Tacitus and Vikings, etc. All of this is now the upper stage of barbarism. Basically, once you know how to use iron, you get into the upper stage of barbarism. As soon as you have the Iron Revolution, you also have the Alphabetic Revolution. In other words, people learn how to write the alphabet, and they begin to write it. They don't learn how, they create it, in fact. The iron plowshare drawn by the cattle, which made large-scale agriculture, the cultivation of fields possible for the first time. So now you're not cultivating the soil with a, kai or something. What are you doing? What are you using? You put a bull or an ox or a guy in front, and you get it to move. You use animal power to plow the earth. This is a revolution, people. This is huge. Okay. Clearance of forest of land for tillage and pasture now becomes something that you can do. You didn't need to do that before. Now, how do you do that? You can't do that without an iron axe, an iron spade. You can't cut trees without an iron axe. You can't cut a tree with a stone axe, for God's sakes. So it's once you have this, that you can clear the forests and you can create agriculture over there. Now population rapidly increases, population density increases, and so on. And this is the period where you get some of the first great literature that we have today. At the time that he was writing, of course, the earliest literature was the Iliad of Homer. But now we know that the earliest literature is not the Iliad. The literature that's the oldest is, in fact, from Iraq, and that is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So now we have fully developed iron tools, the bellows, the hand mill, the potter's wheel, the making of oil and wine, metalwork developing almost into a fine art, the wagon and the war chariot, shipbuilding with beams and planks, the beginnings of architecture as art, walled cities with towers and battlements, and the Homeric epic and the complete mythology. This is all the product of the Iron Age, the development of the alphabet. I'm just going to pause here for 5 minutes. What a fantastic sketch, I would say, of of the prehistory of humanity. But this is a different time scale. It's a time scale not in terms of the years that are going by, but it's a time scale in terms of the development of the human mind. That's the scale on which we're moving forward. I know this grates on some of you. I know कि कुछ लोगों को ये बात अच्छी नहीं लगेगी. उसकी वजह क्या है? उसकी वजह ये है कि in social science we often talk about how there is no society that's more advanced and there's no society that's backward. Everybody is equal, and we want everybody to be equal, but they're not equal. We have to recognize that. So, you know, we don't like to use today we don't like to use the term backward and advanced and progress and so on. We don't like those terms. But these are facts of history that we cannot deny. These are facts of history, that there were people who advanced technologically speaking, and there were people who got left behind. Today we are one of the people who is left behind technologically and intellectually speaking, and the advanced civilizations are the ones that dominate the globe today. That's just the fact of the case. I know you don't want to believe it, but that's the reality of the world we live in. If you don't believe me, just look at Palestine. Okay. So now we enter and look at what was the kind of marriage that was taking place now. What was that? He says this is what is called the Punaluan family, or what we will refer to as the pairing family. This is the kind of family in the period of barbarism. It is based on the exclusion of sister and brother, and it develops to exclude also cousins. We still marry and can still marry our first cousins, but in that part of the world, that was first cousins are considered to be brothers and sisters one step removed. They do not marry their first cousins. And in fact, marrying your first cousins, as I've explained to you in a previous class, is genetically very, very bad, etc. So tribes that practiced inbreeding were less likely to survive, and tribes that did not practice inbreeding created this very important taboo, became healthier as a consequence and developed further. And he says this transformation, this taboo emerged in this period of history that he refers to as barbarism. So this was now the pairing family. And you can see this, he says, in the Hawaiian custom. A number of sisters were the common wives of their common husbands. In the Hawaiian family, that's how the family system operated, from among whom their brothers were excluded. So in that system of family, brothers could not be part of that, of course, but otherwise the family was considered to be the whole common sisters and a common set of men, etc. These husbands now called themselves Puna Lua, and that is where we get the name Puna Luan family. That's the Hawaiian term that in their language that they use, and what that means is intimate companion. They would no longer refer to each other as brother, they would refer to each other as Puna Lua, i.e. as intimate companion. Now, children were in this whole period of history identified by their mothers. They often did not know who the father was. In fact, if you look at it in a little more detail, even the understanding that it's the sexual act that results in reproduction is itself something that humanity did not always know about. They understood that the sexual act results in reproduction only after studying it, understanding it, trying to understand it, and so on. Okay, they didn't connect the two things together. In fact, if you look at ancient fertility cults from this particular period, they often thought that it was the moon that results in the impregnation of women, etc. And there were many, many different religious traditions that they had at that time. They would eat various things and they would expose their bellies to the moon thinking, okay, oh, I'll get impregnated, etc. We can read all about this in that ancient literature and in the religions that existed at that particular point in time, because they did not yet understand the role of, of course, the egg and the sperm and sexual reproduction. So for that reason also, since they didn't understand sexual reproduction as such, they didn't understand that the father is actually, what the role of the father is in relation to the child. Of course, they could understand the role of the mother, because physically the child comes from the mother, so there's no doubt there. But as far as the father is concerned, what role is his wasn't clear till this particular period in history. Okay? Just as an animal today would not know the role of sexual reproduction in the creation of children, So we did not know either at some time in history what the connection between children and the sexual act was. So now in this period, the pairing family is one where one man lives with one woman. But the relationship is such that polygamy and occasional infidelity remain the right of the men, even though for economic reasons polygamy is quite rare. While for the woman the strictest fidelity is generally demanded throughout the time she lives with the man, and adultery on her part is cruelly now punished. That was not the case before, but it becomes the case now. The marriage tie can, however, why does he call it a pairing family? How is it different from our monogamous family of today, etc.? The marriage tie can, however, be easily dissolved by either partner, and after separation the children still belong, as before, to the mother alone. So that's one of the big differences between the pairing family and the patriarchal family that comes into being after that. Also, in this entire period of savageries as well as barbarism, you have what is known as, and this is very important, the communist household. What is the communist household? It means the supremacy of women in the house, just as the exclusive recognition of the female parent, owing to the impossibility of recognizing the male parent with certainty, means that the women, the mothers, are held in high respect. So the communist household was one in which many sisters, essentially, and cousins and their daughters would live together. And since they lived together, the khalas were living with the mum, right? And they all had children together. So they would all distribute that work with each other. The cooking, the cleaning, the making the food, the feeding the children, all of this stuff is not done by one woman. It's done by all the sisters together, the children included, and so on. So that's called a communist household. So the men are actually outside the house in that sense. The women are at the heart of the house. Even today when we use the term zanana for a house or for architecture, what we mean is this is where the women are. This is the women's quarters. This is where the internal part of the house is. And in our joint family system, we still have families in which there are many, many women that live together. Of course, we don't have this system, the pairing system, etc. But we have a patriarchal system now. But nonetheless, just for the benefit of your imagination, you can understand that women liked to live together with each other because then they could help each other in that labor. And because they helped each other in that labor, this is very important for, especially if you're a feminist, etc. Because they helped each other, the burden of work got distributed. Because the burden of work got distributed, women actually had more time for public activities. They could have more time to even be amongst their own tribes, etc., leaders of the tribe. They could be, they were often not war leaders, but they could be judges, in that ancient tribal sort of way. They would play a very important role overall in society. They were also priestesses and doctors and midwives and all sorts of other professions that they had. So their social role was actually very, very strong, precisely because their domestic responsibilities were handled in this communist household manner. It's not like people didn't work in this stage of civilization, because this is a hard life. Nobody can sit around. So this is a hard life we're talking about. We're talking about a period in history where people generally work, they have tough lives. Not that anybody thought of it as being a tough life, because they didn't know what an easy life was. But the men had different responsibilities there. It wasn't a home as much. This is called the sexual division of labor, and it also known as the natural division of labor, because when the child is born, today we have powdered milk, etc., all of these things. But at that time, understand that when the child was born, the woman was feeding the child for a very long time, very, very long time. And when one child was fed, then another child had to be fed. And the cycle of pregnancy and birth, because populations were very scarce, very small, and because life was very fragile, the number of deaths of children was very high. The number of deaths of women was very high. So women, literally from when they would become adults till their menopause, etc., were in a constant cycle of birth and pregnancy, birth, and childcare, pregnancy, birth, and childcare. That never ended. Okay, that was part of life. That's just how life was. And so, obviously, if you're feeding the child, it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. And then you have several children. You could have as much as 12 children, etc. So you can imagine that is taking up the vast majority of the time of women. But if you have khalas and everybody else around, it doesn't have to be that you are doing the feeding to your own child. It can also be that you feed some other child, they feed your child, etc., etc. The work gets divided. It's much easier. All right, the communistic household in which most or all of the women belong to one and the same gens, while the men come from various genties, is the material foundation of that supremacy of the women which was general in primitive times. So if you want to understand why were women stronger at that time when society was so underdeveloped, why are they weaker today, you have to understand. This is what you have to understand, that they had this sisterhood. Today in feminist studies, in gender studies, we refer to it as quote unquote sisterhood. But sisterhood has just come to mean politically that you're together. Here they were physically together, they were living together, and they were helping each other as a result. Now we see that the transition to monogamy begins to occur, the transition to modernity, etc. And here's the interesting, fascinating thing. Engels writes, and many other people have written, that this transition is first affected by women. It's the women who want this. They want this transition to occur. The more the traditional sexual relations lost the native primitive character of forest life, yani as humanity came out of the forest, the more oppressive and humiliating must the women have felt them to be, and the greater their longing for the right of chastity, of temporary or permanent marriage with one man only as a way of release. So it was the women who were saying, look, we don't want this pairing marriage business. We want just one man, and we want him to be loyal, and that's it. This was something that initially was brought about by women, he writes. But what was the process that drove it? What was the economic process that drove it? What was happening at the mode of production? He says now, wealth in savagery and barbarism was of the following sort. A house was important, although a house would not be as glorious as it is today, but it was a dwelling. Clothing was important. This is what wealth constituted at that time. Crude ornaments and the tools for obtaining and preparing food, boat, weapons, and domestic utensils of the simplest kinds. This is what wealth looked like back then in the age of savagery, etc. That's it. So who got these things? Who got the house? Who got the boats, the weapons, the ornaments, the tools, etc.? It was the children of the mother. Through the mother, you would get this wealth. The mother, because she controlled the house, these things belonged to the house. So when you inherited the house inherited these tools. Wealth was given via the mother to the children. Now, but as you entered into civilization, etc., the whole situation began to change. The new form of wealth was what? It was animals. It was herds of horses, camels, asses, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. And of course, a little later, you also had slaves in addition to that. This was the new form of wealth. You want evidence of this? Do you know that the word capital comes from the word cap, which literally means the head? That's why you say cap, I'm wearing a cap. The head of what? Cattle. So as the form of wealth became cattle, that's where you used to say, I've got 10 caps, 10 heads of cattle. And from there you got the word capitalism or capital. The primary form of wealth became what? Animals. Now who was taking care of the animals? Who was in charge of the domestication of animals? The women were in charge of the house. That's where they ruled. They were in charge of the house, the tools in the house, the kitchen utensils, everything to do with that. The children, all the wealth was there. The domestication of animals, the animals, who was in charge of that? The men. So now this wealth began to grow. This wealth in animals began to grow. And as it began to grow, we see a transition. And as the transition occurs, we also see the transition in how humanity thinks in its religious terms. Female gods are conquered by male gods. This is Enlil, the great mountain, a male god. This is Enki, the Sumerian god of water, knowledge, crafts, and creation. So the big question became, who gets the herd? Where will the herd go? I have 50 sheep, okay, or 25 cattle. Where is it going to go? That's the question that society began to ask. In barbarism, according to the division of labor within the family at that time, it was the man's part to obtain food and the instruments of labor necessary for the purpose. He therefore also owned the instruments of labor, and the event of husband and wife separating, he took them with him, just as she retained her household goods. So the division was, I'll take these hunting things, and you will take everything connected to the house if we separate. Those are my things, those are your things. Okay, we separate that way. Therefore, according to the social custom of the time, the man was also the owner of the new source of subsistence, the cattle, and later of the new instruments of labor, the slaves. But according to the custom of the same society, his children could not inherit from him. How interesting. So I have a child with a woman, but my child is not going to inherit my cattle. Because according to the way in which the tribes are structured, who inherits my cattle? It's going to be from my woman's side, from the woman's side that the inheritance of my cattle is going to occur. So from my female gen it's going to occur, not from the male gen, right? So that's a separate household, and I have a separate household, and my children who are born from that woman in that household are not going to get the stuff that I have dedicated my life to building, all the wealth. But I want it to go to my children. But the children don't belong to my gens, they belong to the woman's. This created a conflict. When the owner of the herd dies, his herd would go first to his brothers and sisters and to his sisters' children, or to the issue of his mother's sisters. But his own children were disinherited. है ना मजेदार किस्म की बात? Kitni interesting. The way in which savagery and barbarism, because it had constructed the family around the woman, around the mother, around the women, I should say rather, therefore the men, when they died, their wealth would go not to their children who belonged to, of course, a household of women. They would get the wealth from the woman's side. They would not get it from the man's side. So where would my wealth go? It would go to Puppy's children. That's how the system was working. So what did the men want? The men now wanted that it should go to my own child. And frankly, some of the women may have wanted that as well. Why should my child from that man not get that man's cattle and sheep, etc.? You know, why should my children not inherit from their father? This brought about what he refers to as the defeat of mother right. This is when women are defeated. What does this mean? And in fact, women are, in a certain sense, for the children's sake, they are participating in that defeat themselves, in a way. So what is mother right firstly? Mother right is that my child will inherit from me as a mother. Father right is that the children will inherit from the father. In proportion as wealth increased, it made the man's position in the family more important than the woman's, and on the other hand created an impulse to exploit the strengthened position in order to overthrow in favor of his children the traditional order of inheritance. The man now wanted to overthrow mother right. Why? It's like, these are my children, I want to give it to them, I want to give my wealth to them. Mother right therefore had to be overthrown, and overthrown it was. A simple decree sufficed that in the future the offspring of the male members should retain within the gens, but that of the female should be excluded by being transferred to the gens of their father. In other words, the children from the women will belong now to my gens, as opposed to belonging to the gens of the woman. The reckoning of descent in the female line and the matriarchal law of inheritance were thereby overthrown, and the male line of descent and the paternal law of inheritance was substituted for them. Mother right is overthrown. You're not inheriting from your mother, you'll inherit from your father. And since you're inheriting from your father, therefore you are now part of the father's clan. The whole system is now going to undergo a revolution. The overthrow of mother right was the world historic defeat of the female sex. The overthrow of mother right was the world historic defeat of the female sex. This is where everything began to change. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. In fact, the term famulus means domestic slave, and familia is the total number of slaves belonging to one man. That's the Latin word, that's the Roman word, that's the word we use every day, family. Famulus literally means slave. The term was invented by the Romans to denote a new social organism whose head ruled over wife and children and a number of slaves, and was invested under Roman paternal power with rights of life and death over them. Over my wife, children, and slaves, as a Roman, I would have complete authority. I could sell my children into slavery if I wanted to. I could sell my wife into slavery if I wanted to. If I killed them, the state is not going to do anything to me. I own them. That's patriarchy. That's real patriarchy. Let's look at what was going on in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, which just basically is a fancy word for Iraq. The father had the power of life and death over his children. He had the power to commit infanticide by exposure or abandonment in Mesopotamia. This is Babylonian civilization, Akkadian, Sumerian we are talking about. He could give his daughters in marriage in exchange for receiving a bride price, even during their childhood. Or he could consecrate them to a life of virginity in the temple service if he wanted to. He could arrange marriages for children of both sexes. A man could pledge his wife, his concubines, and their children as pawns for his death. If he failed to pay back the debt, these pledges would be turned into debt slaves. This was the power that the man had in Iraq, Mesopotamia, in that ancient civilization, Babylonian civilization. And the patriarchal family, the modern family, contains in germ, writes Marx, not only slavery, but also serfdom, since from the beginning it is related to agricultural services. It contains in miniature all the contradictions which later extend throughout society and its state. In other words, in latent and small form, you already see the class antagonism emerge in the first patriarchal society. And this is why also then you get honor killings. In order to make certain of the wife's fidelity and therefore of the paternity of the children, she is delivered over unconditionally into the power of the husband. If he kills her, he is only exercising his right. So what is happening here is that the women's role now is being constrained. Why? Because I want to give my wealth to my children. But how do I know that the children from that woman, who is my wife, are really my children? The only way they could guarantee this in the old times, when they didn't have DNA testing and they didn't have blood tests, etc., how would you know? The only way you can know is to prohibit her from being with any other man. That's the only way I can be sure that the children she has are really my children. And so a whole group of taboos are created to control women's sexuality. The whole purpose of which is one and one purpose alone, which is to ensure that the children really are mine in a society where there was no other way to know whose children they was. So you get the emergence now of a new kind of family, the patriarchal monogamous family. So the patriarchal monogamous family now emerges. It is based on the supremacy of the man, the express purpose being to produce children of undisputed paternity. This is the marriage contract in the period that we refer to as civilization, what we refer to as quote-unquote monogamous marriage. What is at stake here? What is at stake is undisputed paternity, not maternity. Maternity is never going to be disputed. You know that the child is the mother's. Paternity can be disputed. So undisputed paternity will only occur where women are completely cloistered off, segregated, etc. Because these children are later to come into their father's property as his natural heirs. It is distinguished from pairing marriage by the much greater strength of the marriage tie, which can no longer be dissolved at either partner's wish. As a rule, it is now only the man who can dissolve it and put away his wife. The right of conjugal infidelity also remains secure to him. He doesn't have to be monogamous to her. Please note. And as social life develops, he exercises his right more and more. Should the wife recall the old form of sexual life and attempt to revive it, she is punished more severely than ever. So I can be a philanderer because that will not put the paternity of my children in dispute in any way. But my wife cannot associate with other men because that may put the paternity of her children in dispute, that are they mine, are they not mine? And if they're not mine, then I'm giving my inheritance and wealth to children who are not mine. And that creates the whole male anxiety, so to speak. This results in the subjugation of one sex by the other. Monogamy, which developed first amongst the Greeks, was not in any way the fruit of individual sex love. He uses the term sex love, but we today just use the word love. So he's just saying it was not the product of love. So monogamy, which first develops amongst the Greeks, he writes, was not in any way the fruit of individual love, sex love, or anything, with which it had nothing whatever to do. Marriages remained as before, marriages of convenience. It was the first form of the family to be based not on natural but on economic conditions, on the victory of private property over primitive, natural, communal property. It was always about wealth and property. Marriage was not about love in this period. Didn't matter whether you loved her or didn't love her. That's not the point. The point is to secure undisputed paternity in order that the child will get your inheritance. Monogamous marriage comes on the scene as the subjugation of the one sex by the other. It announces a struggle between the sexes, unknown throughout the whole previous prehistoric period. There is no great gender struggle going on before this transformation. Now what do you see? You see that men and women, one has subjugated the other, and therefore you see now a ladai open up between them, a contradiction between them. And so woman becomes the first class. Wow, listen. Marx wrote, the first division of labor is that between man and woman for the propagation of children. That's very clear. That's why it's called the natural division of labor. And today, Engels says, I can add the first class opposition that appears in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage. And the first class oppression coincides with that of the female sex by the male. Wow. Far from not putting women front and center, he says the first form of exploitation, class struggle, classes, is between men and women. Gender is the oldest form of class struggle. That's what he's saying. Monogamous marriage was a great historical step forward. Did I read that right? Why is it a step forward? This is so strange. Nevertheless, together with slavery and private wealth, it opens the period that has lasted until today, in which every step forward is also relatively a step backwards, in which prosperity and development for some is won through the misery and frustration of others. It is the cellular form of civilized society in which the nature of the oppositions and contradictions fully active in that society can be already studied. This kind of society where a few benefit at the expense of the other, one section benefits at the expense of the other, already develops with this early monogamous family. Class antagonisms develop. And now prostitution emerges with patriarchy. In the period of group marriage, there was a tradition of ceremonial surrender by which women purchased the right of chastity. Surrender for money was at first a religious act. It took place in the temple of the goddess of love, and the money originally went into the temple treasury. So this was already a tradition in the old pairing family, okay? That I don't want to be with other men, I just want to be with this man. The man and the woman decide, they pay a sum to the temple, etc. They secure themselves as a couple, etc. But with civilization, the temple dancing girls were now transformed into prostitutes. How did this happen? Hetairism, which is another word for these temple prostitutes and so on, continues the old sexual freedom to the advantage of the men. Actually not merely tolerated, but gaily practiced. Badi khushi se. By the ruling classes particularly, it is condemned in words. Lafzon mein badi buri baat hai, badi buri baat hai. But then everybody, all the men are practicing it. But in reality, this condemnation never falls on the men concerned. It never falls on the men, okay, what are you doing? But only on the women. They are despised and outcast in order that the unconditional supremacy of men over the female sex may be once more proclaimed as a fundamental law of society. When these sexual relations outside of marriage occur, the men say, oh, we're still going to do whatever we want to do. But the men are not condemned for it. Who are condemned for it? The women with whom they have those relations. They are only condemned for it. So begins a period of history in which war creates also this whole idea of taking women as slaves. If you have a tribal war, kill the men or enslave them, etc., and enslave the women. So as slavery now becomes more and more an established institution, as it continues to grow, this is, now that I have a herd of cattle, I have to take care of it. My brother has to take care of it. Now it's to my benefit to get some slaves to do the work. So in the original tribal war, I would just kill the men and then take the women slaves. But now I have use for the men as well. What am I going to do with the men? The men are going to work the herd. They're going to take care of the cattle. And I can sit back and relax. And the women will serve me. Slave owners rented out their female slaves now as prostitutes. And some masters set up commercial brothels staffed by slaves. Society could not distinguish anymore between slaves and free upper class women. I'm talking here about, specifically about Mesopotamia, Iraq. In Iraq, as slavery developed, in Babylon, as slavery developed, and as more and more women were enslaved, now what were the women doing? They were taking care of the sexual needs of men. The marriage was for what reason? Not for sexual reasons. The marriage was for property. That was the purpose of that. For sexual reasons, the men would satisfy themselves with a whole group of slave women. But now it became impossible to tell, as slavery grew, it became impossible to differentiate the slave women from the women who were not slaves, who were married. How was this going to happen now? What are we going to do? So in 1250 before Christ, to distinguish slaves from free women, public veiling was introduced as law in Mesopotamia. This is 1,250 years before Jesus Christ. This is almost 2,000 years before the Prophet, peace be upon him. This is already law in the Middle East. In Iraq, what is the law? Middle Assyrian law, 1450 BC. Neither wives of the seigneurs, nor widows, nor Assyrian women who go out on the streets may have their heads uncovered. The daughters of a seigneur, whether it is a shawl or a robe or a mantle, must veil themselves. When they go out on the streets alone, they must veil themselves. A concubine who goes out to the street with her mistress must veil herself. A sacred prostitute whom a man married must veil herself on the street. But one whom a man did not marry must have her head uncovered on the street. She must not veil herself. A harlot must not veil herself. Her head must be uncovered. The sex slave is not permitted to put anything on her head. That is the dress code they introduce. A slave woman is not allowed to cover her face. She's not allowed to cover her face. He who has seen a harlot veiled must arrest her, produce witnesses, and bring her to the palace tribunal. They shall not take her jewelry away, but the one who arrested her may take her clothing. They shall flog her 50 times with staves and pour pitch on her head. The punishment for a slave girl who is caught wearing a veil, she shall have her clothes taken away and have her ears cut off. Sunte jao. If a seigneur has seen a harlot veiled and has let her go without bringing her to the palace tribunal, they shall flog that seigneur 50 times with staves. They shall pierce his ears, thread them with a cord, and tie it at his back, and he shall do the work of the king for 1 full month. If you have seen a woman who is a slave veiling herself, and you don't bring her to the palace, you don't report her, this is what I'm going to do to you. Kaisa? And it's written right there. That's the code of Hammurabi. It's written right there. जी हाँ, आज तक लोग उसको पढ़ सकते हैं. 2,000 years before Islam, as I told you. The wives of a man or widow or any Assyrian women who go out in the main street shall not have their head bare. Like a warrior in battle, she is cast down in her own blood. Her eyes are diminished. She cannot see. Her lips are covered. She cannot open them. Her ears no longer hear. Her breast is no longer high. Her curls are scattered. She no longer wears the veil. She no longer feels shame. O merciful God, Marduk, be present and save her. Any woman who is a free woman, who does not veil herself, is what? She is shameless. A whole ideology is introduced now to distinguish between sex slaves and non-slaves. That's the uniform that's introduced. And if a woman is caught outside of a uniform, either way, if she's a free woman, she's not covering herself, she's shameless, maro isko. If she is a slave woman and she's covering herself, she's also shameless, maro isko bhi. A concubine who goes about in the main thoroughfare with her mistress must be veiled. If a man would veil his concubine, he shall assemble 5 or 6 of his friends. He shall veil her in their presence. He shall declare, she is my wife, she is his wife. A concubine who is not veiled in the presence of the people, whose husband did not declare, she is my wife, she is not a wife, she is indeed a concubine. So I can veil someone who is my concubine and thereby say she's under my protection now. She cannot do it herself, but I can do it. Slave women shall not be veiled, and whoever should see a veiled slave woman shall seize her and bring her to the palace entrance. They shall cut off her ears. He who has seized her shall take her clothing. Clothing used to be very important back in the day, right? Very expensive. If a man should see a veiled slave woman and releases her and not seizes her and does not bring her to the palace entrance, and they then prove the charges against him and find him guilty, they shall strike him 50 blows with rods. They shall pierce his ears and thread them on a cord, tie it at his back. The one who informs against him shall take his garments. He shall perform the king's service for 1 full month. Engels writes, amongst all ruling classes, matrimony remained what it had been since the pairing marriage, a matter of convenience, which was arranged by the parents. The first historical form of sexual love, as passionate, was by no means conjugal. It was not occurring within marriage. The purpose of marriage was not love in this period of history. In its classical form, amongst the provincials, that is the French, it heads straight for adultery, and the poets of love celebrated adultery. So French writing, literature of this period celebrates the chivalrous knight who Romeo and Juliet like comes to the woman and so on and so forth, etc., etc. That's all there in medieval literature. It was not love for your wife that the poets were talking about. She was often the wife of someone else. And what is the form of the marriage? He says, कहता है 2 किस्म की marriages हैं, Catholic and Protestant. In the Catholic countries, the parents procure a suitable wife for their young bourgeois son, and the consequence is the husband abandons himself to hetairism and the wife to adultery. They don't love each other, zabardasti shadi kara dete hain, that's it. Probably the only reason why the Catholic Church abolished divorce was because it had convinced itself that there is no more a cure for adultery than there is for death. They said, adultery to honi hai, let's just make divorce illegal so that they can't separate ever. What happens in Protestant countries, the rule is that the son of a bourgeois family is allowed to choose a wife from his own class with more or less freedom. He can choose a woman, but only from his own class. Hence, there may be a certain element of love in the marriage. थोड़ी बहुत प्यार भी हो जाता है, क्योंकि खुद अपनी पसंद की शादी की है. Here, the husband's hetairism is of a more sleepy kind of business, and adultery by the wife is less the rule. They don't, go here and there as much because it's a love ki shadi. All that this Protestant monogamy achieves is a conjugal partnership of leaden boredom known as domestic bliss. And then, of course, there's the latent prostitution within marriage. Pashan ho rahe ho. It's heavy stuff. कहता है, in both cases, whether Catholic or Protestant, the marriage is conditioned by the class position of the parties and is to that extent always a marriage of convenience. In both cases, this marriage of convenience turns often enough into the crassest prostitution, sometimes of both partners, the boy as well as the poor girl, but far more commonly of the woman, who only differs from the ordinary courtesan in that she does not let out her body on piecework as a wage worker, but sells it once and for all into slavery. If you want to know more about this, read Jane Austen, the literature of that time. This is exactly what it's describing. It describes exactly this. How the society is just gearing up these women to marry the richest guy or whatever, etc., Mr. Darcy and the rest of it, right? You've seen, all the literature is full of it. So what he's saying is not like something crazy. We see it in the literature of the time. What about the proletarians, though? He says, love, or sex love, as he calls it, in the relationship with a woman becomes, and can only become, the real rule amongst the oppressed classes. Why? Here there is no property, for the preservation and inheritance of which monogamy and male supremacy were established. Hence, there is no incentive to make this male supremacy effective. Here, quite other personal and social conditions decide who they're going to marry or not marry. Because amongst the poorer people, there is no question of really big money involved in the choice of marriage. It's amongst the ruling class that this whole maneuvering takes place. And now that large-scale industry has taken the wife out of the home, into the labor market, and into the factory, and made her often the breadwinner of the family, no basis for any kind of male supremacy is left in the proletarian household. Ab to biwi khud kamati hai. But except perhaps for something of the brutality towards women that has spread since the introduction of monogamy. So the basis of patriarchy is finished, but because of the creation of monogamy, wife beating, brutality towards women, that continues to exist, because that all has come as a consequence, he's saying, of patriarchy, essentially. Proletariat marriage, therefore, he says, is monogamous marriage in the etymological sense of the word, but not at all in its historical sense. What does he mean here? Yani ke jo Christian monogamous marriage ke rules, procedures hain, that's not what it's following. It's actually truly a monogamous marriage. It's not done for property. The modern marriage, he says, just sometimes open, sometimes concealed form of slavery of the wife. In the old communist household, housework was as much a public and socially necessary industry. But with the patriarchal family, housework became a private service. The wife became the head servant. And of course, most of the work had to be done by the wife. She's no longer with her sisters. Sisterhood is broken. The communist household is broken. She is now in the man's house. Mavish is no longer with her sisters. She's in my house. Industry opens to women the road of social production. Capitalist industry now changes all of that, because now women are leaving the home sphere and entering the workforce in millions of numbers. But if she carries out her duties in the private service of her family, she remains excluded from public production and unable to earn. If she is a good mother and a good at housework, then she can't build a career. And if she wants to take part in public production and earn independently, she cannot carry out her family duties. So here you see the double burden that feminist literature so often talks about. That's what has happened. In this marriage, the husband is really the bourgeois. The husband is obligated to earn a living and support his family according to our society, and that in itself gives him a position of supremacy, without any need for special legal titles and privileges. Within the family, he is the bourgeois, and the wife represents the proletariat. He has the power. And so, a whole set of narratives are created, or a whole narrative is created around who can and when they can enjoy sexual freedom. Through history, women are increasingly deprived of sexual freedom. That's basically been the trend of history. What for the woman is a crime, entailing grave legal and social consequences, is considered honorable in a man, or at the worst, a slight moral blemish, which he cheerfully bears. हाँ यार क्या करें, मैं तो हूँ ही ऐसा रंगीन मिजाज हूँ, क्या करूँ? मगर औरत रंगीन मिजाज हो मार देंगे, कत्ल कर देंगे. Prostitution degrades only the unfortunate women who become its victims, and even those by no means to the extent commonly believed. You may believe that a prostitution is degraded, but she's not really as degraded as who? It degrades the character of the whole male world. It is men who are degraded by the creation of prostitution, more than the prostitute, much more. So we see now that marriage was never about love. It was created out of the need to bequeath wealth to children, to have undisputed paternity for inheritance. Here is some data from Gallup poll, which says 85% of Pakistanis say that they met their spouse through parents or close relatives. Only 5% say it was a love marriage. Marriage is not about love. Families tell you who to marry, who not to marry, etc., etc. You see that? But now he says, if all of this is done away with, if you have a new kind of social system, if you have socialism, all of this will be swept away. Because with socialism, private property will be transformed into social property. A new kind of marriage will take place, a marriage based on individual sex love, by which he means individual sexual love, as opposed to platonic love, which is just, let's have a good conversation and talk about abstractions and essences, etc. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about attraction, sexual attraction. So love between, two people who want to be intimate with each other. Till now, marriage was never decided by the partners in history. He's talking about marriage amongst the ruling class. In savagery, people were born married to an entire group of the opposite sex. In barbarism, the mothers settled marriages of their children in light of what would give them a stronger position in the tribe. And in so-called civilization, it was all about wealth and social status, power, and so on. What about love marriage then? He says, full freedom of marriage can therefore only be generally established. That doesn't mean love marriages don't take place. But the general rule where marriages are based on love, when the abolition of capitalist production and of the property relations created by it has removed all the accompanying economic considerations which still exert such a powerful influence on the choice of a marriage partner. For then there is no other motive left except mutual inclination, except love. Right now marriages occur, oh my God, you're looking so depressed, sir, आपने तुम्हारी जिंदगी तबाह कर दी. नहीं, ऐसा कुछ नहीं है. Okay, you are emerging in that time period of history where things are changing. But this is what has happened in history. Marriage was not about love. Your grandparents didn't say marry out of love. Maybe your parents didn't. It was always settled by the families. And as sexual love is by its nature exclusive. When you love someone, you only want to be with that person, right? Although at present this exclusiveness is fully realized only in the woman, the marriage based on sexual love is by its nature individual marriage. Because you love someone, you want to be with them. They want to be with you. It's mutual. So what will come about now? What will happen? He says, I don't know. What kind of marriage structures will exist in communist societies? He says, I don't know. That will be answered. I love this passage. It's my favorite passage from all the books I've read from Marx and Engels. He says that will be answered when a new generation has grown up. A generation of men. He says a generation of men who never in their lives have known what it is to buy a woman's surrender with money or any other social instrument of power. That's what we need. A generation of men who don't even know what it means to be able to influence somebody through wealth and social power in order for a woman to, sort of say, oh, okay, I'll marry you. A generation of women who have never known what it is to give themselves to a man for any other considerations than real love, or to refuse to give themselves to their lover from fear of the economic consequences. When these people are in the world, they will care precious little what anybody today thinks they ought to do. They will make their own practice and their corresponding public opinion about the practice of each individual, and that will be the end of it. खुद फैसला करेंगे. But the key thing to understand is that compelling a woman through the power of your wealth to submit, or being compelled by a man through his wealth and power to submit, that will be eliminated in the next stage of civilization. So to conclude, patriarchy is not natural. It's not it doesn't come out of our biology. It has nothing to do with physical strength whatsoever. Hunter-gatherer societies were actually matrilineal and matrilocal and practiced inheritance through the mother. Clans were organized around women, not around the father, not around men. During savagery, the form of marriage was group marriage. During the next stage, barbarism, it transformed into pairing marriage. And then with the development of wealth, which was primarily in the form of herds of cattle, sheep, goat, etc., this resulted in the defeat of mother right. Matrilineal clans, matrilocal marriage patterns, and mother right were broken. The monogamous form of marriage, along with prostitution, developed. Women, slaves, became prostitutes and concubines. Veiling began in Mesopotamia to distinguish free women from slaves. Only the end of private property, therefore, can destroy patriarchy. I would highly recommend these two amazing books to you in addition to Engels' work, which I have more or less summarized for you. The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner, an incredible book, really phenomenal, talks about Mesopotamian, the laws, etc., that I spoke about from Iraq, Mesopotamia, etc. I learned from here, from this phenomenal, great classic of feminist literature. And When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone, a phenomenal work because it looks at all the instances where women were worshipped or women goddesses were worshipped, and then how that transformed to male worship, etc. Both of these are amazing pieces of work.